The studio lights dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the sleek set of the Trevor Noah Hour. The usual vibrant energy seemed to wane, replaced by a heavy tension that hung palpably in the air. Trevor, ever the charismatic host with a mischievous grin, was about to meet an unexpected storm. Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stage, not as a mere guest, but as a force of unyielding presence. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the room with an intensity that silenced the usual buzz of anticipation. There was no room here for frivolity or witty banter. This was a man burdened by the weight of a nation's hopes and failures. The subtle tremor in Trevor's voice betrayed a flicker of unease as he attempted his customary light-hearted greeting, but Traoré's stoic demeanor left no cracks for humor to seep through. In that suspended moment, the air thickened with an unspoken challenge. Trevor's practiced charm faltered under the gaze of a leader whose experience was carved not in boardrooms or studio sets, but on the rugged front lines of political upheaval. The audience felt it too, a sudden shift from entertainment to confrontation, from laughter to reflection. It was as if the very fabric of the show had been rewoven, threads pulling taut with the raw urgency of real human struggle. The usual cadence of questions and jokes gave way to a quieter, more deliberate rhythm, one that demanded respect and, more importantly, understanding. Ibrahim Traoré's presence was a mirror reflecting not just his own convictions but the collective pain and resilience of a people too long silenced. His silence spoke volumes, each measured word that would come later poised to unravel layers of complexity that transcended headlines. The opening seconds of the encounter revealed more than political discord. They exposed the fragile humanity behind the public facade, a drama unfolding in the quiet spaces between the questions. Trevor, momentarily disarmed, realized this was no ordinary interview. This was a collision of worlds, of ideology, of history, and of raw, unvarnished truth, where every glance, every pause, carried the weight of consequences far beyond the camera's gaze. The tension between Trevor and Ibrahim was electric, crackling in the charged atmosphere like a storm ready to break. Trevor's usual fluidity, that effortless blend of humor and insight, now felt brittle under the weight of Ibrahim's unwavering stare, a gaze that seemed to peel back layers of pretense and superficiality. It wasn't just an exchange of words, it was a battle of essences, two worlds clashing in silent symphony. Trevor, with his polished charm and razor-sharp wit, was the embodiment of media savvy, of a culture that thrives on spectacle and sound bites. Ibrahim, on the other hand, was carved from the raw granite of lived experience. His every word measured, loaded with the burden of history, sacrifice, and an unyielding moral compass. As Trevor attempted to steer the conversation into familiar waters, light jabs, quick laughs, he found his usual arsenal blunted. Ibrahim's responses weren't just answers. They were challenges, reframing the narrative with a quiet ferocity that unsettled the set. Each carefully chosen phrase carried the weight of entire communities, voices long drowned out by noise and distraction. Trevor felt it, the familiar dance of control slipping, the subtle but relentless pressure to adapt, to confront realities that refused to be simplified. His eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and respect. Here was a man who didn't play by the rules, who refused to be tamed by the spectacle. The audience sensed it too, caught in the pull between Trevor's charismatic energy and Ibrahim's formidable presence. The air vibrated with a complex cocktail of anticipation, unease, and reluctant admiration. Trevor's laughter, once a shield, now sounded hollow at times, a fragile veneer cracking under the strain of unvarnished truth. Ibrahim's silence between sentences was not emptiness but a calculated pause, a space for gravity to settle, for listeners to absorb the depth beneath the surface. The exchange transcended a mere interview. It became a psychological duel, an intricate dance where words were weapons, silences were statements, and every nuance carried an emotional freight. In those moments, Trevor glimpsed the chasm between their worlds. His rooted in performance and persuasion, Ibrahim's in survival and conviction. Neither could fully inhabit the other's space, yet both were irrevocably changed by the encounter. The confrontation was not just about ideas but about identity, about what it means to speak and be heard in a world fragmented by voices competing to dominate. As the conversation pressed forward, the atmosphere thickened, not with hostility, but with the raw, vulnerable power of two minds refusing to yield, forging a fragile connection amid the clash. When Ibrahim Traoré finally broke the charged silence, his voice was low, steady, yet unmistakably resolute, cutting through the thick air like a blade sharpened on years of struggle. There was no need for grandiose gestures or theatrical flourishes. Every word was deliberate, heavy with the weight of lived experience and unshakable conviction. The room seemed to hold its breath, caught in the gravity of the moment, as if time itself had slowed to watch this man lay bare not just his thoughts, but the aching soul of a people long oppressed and overlooked. "I stand here not as a politician seeking applause or fleeting headlines," Ibrahim began, his eyes locking onto Trevor's with an intensity that brooked no dissent. "I stand as the voice of the forgotten, the silenced, the ones crushed beneath the wheels of systems that promise progress but deliver only decay. For too long we have been told to wait, to be patient, to trust in the promises of others. But patience without justice is nothing but a chain, binding us to the past's failures, suffocating the future's potential." Each word was a strike against complacency, a call to confront the raw, uncomfortable truths that hide behind polished rhetoric. The faintest tremor of emotion flickered in his voice, not weakness, but the depth of a man who carries the pain of countless lives as if it were his own skin. His gaze softened briefly, revealing the human cost behind the steely exterior, a cost measured in lives disrupted, dreams deferred, and dignity stolen. "We are done waiting," he declared, voice rising with a controlled fury that stirred the hearts of even the most skeptical. "If change is to come, it will not arrive on the wings of empty promises, but through the courage to break the chains, to reclaim what was stolen, and to build anew on foundations of truth and dignity." As Ibrahim's words echoed in the charged silence, Trevor's usual mask of humor and ease faltered, revealing a flicker of something deeper: respect, unease, and perhaps a dawning awareness of the magnitude behind the man before him. The audience sat spellbound, caught in the raw, unfiltered moment where rhetoric became reality, where words were no longer mere sounds but a powerful testament to resilience and defiance. In that declaration, Ibrahim Traoré transformed from a guest into a symbol, a living embodiment of the struggle for justice, speaking not just to the camera, but to every soul yearning for a future reclaimed from the shadows of neglect and betrayal. The room shifted palpably as the conversation veered sharply into the tangled web of economics and policy, a territory where ideals often collided with harsh realities, where every word was laden with the potential to unravel or rebuild. Trevor, with a practiced ease that masked his inner turmoil, launched into his familiar spiel about market-driven growth and the promises of globalization. His voice was smooth, persuasive, weaving statistics and buzzwords into a tapestry meant to reassure and inspire confidence. But beneath the polished rhetoric, there lingered a tension, an undercurrent of doubt that even he struggled to suppress. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed, the weight of his own experience carving shadows across his face. He listened, not just to refute, but to dissect the very foundation of Trevor's assertions. When he spoke, his tone was calm but unmistakably charged, each sentence a carefully aimed probe into the fractures of a system that had long favored the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. "Economic growth," he said quietly, "is not measured merely by numbers on a balance sheet, nor by the fleeting smiles of stock markets. It is measured by the lives transformed or destroyed, by policies that claim to uplift but often deepen inequality." The words hung heavy in the space between them, a challenge that went beyond debate to something almost primal, a demand for truth in a world often cloaked in illusion. Ibrahim's gaze swept the room, finding the faces of those caught in the silent struggle between hope and despair. "Policies," he continued, voice rising with a restrained passion, "must serve the people, not the profits of a few. When markets dictate terms, when profits overshadow humanity, we build towers on sand. Cracks appear, and beneath them lie the forgotten, the crushed, the invisible masses whose stories never make the headlines." Trevor's jaw tightened, the veneer of confidence flickering as he grappled with the undeniable force behind Ibrahim's words. The usual tools of persuasion, statistics, economic jargon, polished soundbites, felt suddenly inadequate, hollow against the raw urgency emanating from his opponent. For a moment, the room held its breath, caught in the collision of two worlds, one shaped by theory and presentation, the other forged in the crucible of lived hardship and relentless hope. The debate spiraled deeper, each point a thread unraveling the neat fabric of easy answers. Ibrahim spoke of systemic corruption, of policies designed to entrench power rather than disperse it, of communities starved of resources, education, and opportunity under the guise of austerity and reform. His voice trembled, not with fear but with the fierce resolve of someone carrying the weight of countless shattered dreams. To build true progress, he insisted, we must listen to those who live the consequences of these policies, not just those who profit from them. Justice is not a commodity to be traded. It is a foundation to be laid with care, humility, and unwavering commitment. As the conversation wore on, Trevor found himself shifting, the lines between adversary and interlocutor blurring. In Ibrahim's relentless critique, there was a mirror reflecting his own uncertainties, his own battles with a system that often seemed to demand compromise at the expense of conscience. The psychological dance between them was intricate, a blend of challenge, recognition, and an unspoken search for common ground amid deep divides. When at last the tension eased, it was not with resolution but with a profound, uneasy understanding. Neither had conquered the other. Instead, they had exposed the fault lines beneath their convictions, revealing the fragile humanity that underpinned even the fiercest debates. The room exhaled collectively, the echoes of their exchange lingering like a raw, pulsating heartbeat, an invitation to reckon with complexity, to embrace discomfort, and to pursue a future where economy and policy served not just ambition, but dignity and hope. Trevor's fingers curled slightly around the edge of his clipboard, knuckles paling beneath the studio lights. He tried to maintain the polished poise that had made him one of the most respected figures on late-night television, but something in the air had shifted. Intangible, electric, as if the truth were creeping through the cracks of every carefully framed question and response. Ibrahim's words lingered like smoke, impossible to wave away. They clung not just to the conversation, but to Trevor's very conscience, pressing against the thin wall he'd built between his role as a host and the quiet unrest that had begun gnawing at his own beliefs. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if trying to peer deeper into Ibrahim's soul, to find the source of this disquiet that had taken root inside him. "But you speak with such certainty," Trevor said, his voice just slightly more pointed, the tone betraying a hint of skepticism, as though all institutions are inherently broken, as though reform is a fantasy. "Don't you think that kind of fatalism can be dangerous?" Ibrahim didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he looked at Trevor the way one might look at a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unaware of the drop beneath his feet. "It's not fatalism," he said, voice quiet, steady. "It's recognition. Recognition of wounds that have been reopened time and again under the guise of healing. Of promises that taste of ash when spoken too many times by those who never intend to keep them." That calm unnerved Trevor more than any shout could have. He felt his defenses twitching, rising. Was this man challenging his integrity? His intelligence? Or was it something far more dangerous? Was he speaking to the part of Trevor that had once burned with righteous indignation before comfort dulled it into something passive and presentable? The next question came not from the script, but from somewhere deeper, perhaps darker. "You say you fight for the people," Trevor pressed, his tone sharper now. "But isn't there always a risk that such conviction turns into self-righteousness? Into authoritarianism masked as revolution? How do we trust that your vision doesn't simply replace one form of control with another?" The air crackled with tension. For the first time, the polished dance of words gave way to something raw, volatile. Trevor felt it in his chest, a slow thud of unease, not because he doubted Ibrahim's sincerity, but because he feared he might be right. And if Ibrahim was right, then what did that make Trevor? A bystander? A mouthpiece? Or worse, an accomplice? Ibrahim leaned in. His eyes lit not with anger, but with a haunting empathy. "That's the question every system fears. Who decides what is right? Who defines freedom and who polices it? I don't ask for blind trust. Ask for awareness, for vigilance, for people to reclaim the power to question, to resist, to dream beyond the limits they've been told are immutable. Trevor swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The mask of the interviewer was slipping, replaced by something far more vulnerable, an internal unraveling. Ibrahim was not just dismantling ideologies. He was stirring dormant truths in Trevor himself. Doubts he had buried beneath years of careerism and pragmatism, now bubbling to the surface with the slow inevitability of grief. He glanced at the camera, briefly remembering the millions watching, but for a fleeting moment it didn't matter. The studio, the lights, the audience, all faded into the periphery. What remained was the unnerving clarity of Ibrahim's presence and the sense that Trevor was being asked, not by his guest but by his own conscience, to choose between comfort and truth. And as that realization took root, the line between interviewer and interviewee blurred, the conversation no longer a debate but a reckoning. Trevor's suspicion was no longer about Ibrahim. It was about himself, about the stories he had told, the compromises he had made, and the silent complicity of neutrality in a world begging for courage. A beat of silence followed Ibrahim's final words, but it wasn't the comfortable hush of a point well made. It was charged, brittle, like the moment before a pane of glass shatters. Then, without cue or orchestration, a murmur rippled through the audience. Not the rehearsed chuckles or polite applause Trevor's show was used to, but something raw, unsettled. An emotional pulse that throbbed through the room like a vein exposed. Some audience members sat frozen, eyes wide with the gravity of what they'd just heard, their expressions flickering between admiration and unease. Others leaned forward in their seats as if drawn closer by the weight of Ibrahim's truth. A few clapped, softly at first, almost hesitantly, then others followed, more certain, more insistent. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't even unanimous. But it was enough. Enough to shift the atmosphere from passive observation to active reckoning. Trevor felt it instantly. He wasn't used to losing the room. For years, he had been the orchestrator of narrative, the maestro of tone. But now, the strings were out of tune and slipping from his hands. The applause didn't feel like approval. It felt like betrayal. Like control being wrested from him in real time. His mouth moved before his thoughts caught up. "All right," he said too quickly, voice strained at the edges. "Let's remember this is a discussion, not a sermon." It was meant to steady the moment, inject a touch of levity, but it landed wrong. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't even smile. And Trevor felt the flush rise from his collar to his cheeks, shame masquerading as irritation. His hands clenched the cue cards, then tossed them to the table as if they were suddenly meaningless. They were. Every pre-written line, every vetted question. It all felt absurd now, flimsy against the storm Ibrahim had summoned. He leaned in, eyes sharpened by something bordering on desperation. "You're painting a picture here, Ibrahim, of a world with no room for compromise. No shades of gray. Do you really believe that nothing and no one in the system can be redeemed?" Ibrahim didn't flinch. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at Trevor with an unbearable calmness, as if seeing through not just the question, but the man behind it. "I believe redemption is possible," he said. "But not without accountability. And not without courage. Especially from those who've been afforded the privilege of a platform." The words struck with precision, like a surgeon's scalpel, not a warrior's blade. Trevor recoiled, just slightly, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. The audience certainly did. Their silence now wasn't passive. It was watchful, hungry, no longer content to be spectators. They wanted more than entertainment. They wanted truth, and they were watching to see if Trevor could offer it. He blinked, the light suddenly too bright, the studio too small. A crack began to form, not in the set but within him. Deep inside, the version of himself he had curated so carefully began to falter. He wasn't sure when exactly he had stopped believing in the change he used to champion, but now, faced with Ibrahim's unwavering gaze and the audience's quiet expectation, the realization sliced through him with surgical clarity. He had become a custodian of comfort in a world on fire. The teleprompter scrolled on, oblivious to the unraveling. Lines meant for smooth transitions and polished conclusions blinked across the screen, meaningless. Trevor didn't read them. Couldn't. His throat was tight, his breath shallow. He opened his mouth to speak, to regain footing, but what emerged wasn't a question. It was a confession dressed as sarcasm. "Well," he muttered, eyes darting across the silent crowd, "guess I picked the wrong day to stick to the script." Few chuckled. Nervously, pityingly. Trevor felt the sting of it. Not laughter at a joke, but at a man trying to reclaim authority he no longer possessed. Ibrahim didn't smile. He simply sat there, patient, unyielding, like the embodiment of a truth that couldn't be spun or softened. Trevor looked at him and saw not a guest, not an opponent, but a mirror. And in that reflection, he didn't see the man he once hoped to be. He saw the compromises, the capitulations, the silence, all of it laid bare under the soft but merciless light of one man's conviction. It was too much. Trevor stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the studio. He muttered something about a break. His voice thin, brittle, nothing like the authority he once commanded. Someone from the production team rushed in, whispering, guiding, trying to smooth the moment like plaster over a cracked wall. But it was too late. The audience knew. He knew. And as the screen faded to commercial, the air still thrummed with everything that had just been said, and everything that had not. The studio lights dimmed slightly, not by design but as if exhausted by the emotional gravity they had just illuminated. The applause had long since faded, replaced by a heavy quiet, the kind that follows not entertainment but revelation. Trevor had vanished behind the curtain. His exit abrupt, almost fugitive, a man retreating not just from a conversation but from himself. The stage was left in an uncanny hush, like a battlefield moments after the final shot. Ibrahim Traoré remained seated for a moment, unmoving, not out of uncertainty, but out of a quiet, intentional dignity. He did not smile. He did not scan the room for approval. There was no fist raised in triumph, no arrogance in his composure. And yet, everything about him radiated the unmistakable energy of a man who had won, not in spectacle, but in substance. He stood slowly, deliberately, like someone who understood the weight of what had just transpired. His posture was calm but resolute, his gaze sweeping across the audience, not to bask in their reaction but to acknowledge it. Some met his eyes and held them, unsure whether they felt seen, indicted, or both. Others looked down, as if caught in the act of witnessing something truer than they were ready to admit. The cameras were still rolling, though no one had called action. This was no longer television. This was aftermath. As Traoré stepped away from his seat, the floor seemed to give under his feet, not physically, but in how the space itself responded to him. There was a shift in air pressure, in presence. The man who had walked onto the stage an outsider, an academic, perhaps even a liability in the eyes of the producers, now walked off with the quiet certainty of someone who had just altered the emotional architecture of the room. The staff watched him go in silence. No one dared interrupt him with protocol or thanks or empty gestures. The producer, a woman who had once dismissed his segment as the serious bit before the laughs, now stood motionless by the monitors, her hands slightly raised as if unsure whether to stop him or salute him. A stagehand opened the side door automatically, almost reverently, and Traoré passed through without hesitation. He did not look back. Victory, after all, was not in the applause or the headlines that would follow. It was in having said what needed to be said, unflinching, unedited, in front of a machine that had been built to dilute truth into digestible entertainment. Outside, the night air greeted him not with relief, but recognition. It wrapped around him like an old friend, cool, solid, unpretentious. The noise of the city pulsed in the distance, indifferent and eternal. He paused for a moment beneath the halo of a flickering streetlight, breathing it all in. In that instant he felt no elation, no rush of conquest, only clarity, A kind of hard-won peace that doesn't come from winning an argument, but from refusing to betray your own voice. From knowing that, no matter how the episode would be edited, clipped, framed, he had spoken the truth. And that truth had landed. It had pierced. It had made someone tremble. That was enough. He adjusted his coat against the chill and walked into the dark, not as a man retreating from a spotlight, but as someone carrying it forward, one steady step at a time into a world that still didn't know how to listen, but had, for one night, been made to hear. In the days that followed, the interview did not merely circulate. It detonated. Across continents, in boardrooms and classrooms, in newsrooms and night buses, it was dissected with the fever of a cultural rupture. It was not just a television moment. It was a reckoning. The clip of Ibrahim Traoré's quiet fury, of Trevor's unraveling, ricocheted through social media feeds and television reruns with the weight of something historical, like an emotional truth too long buried now clawing its way into daylight. But the aftermath wasn't loud, not entirely. It spread more like a haunting. Viewers described a strange ache in the chest, a lingering tightness behind the eyes. Not because they were entertained, but because they had been implicated. In the West, opinion pieces multiplied like cracks in a veneer. Some condemned Traoré, branding him as confrontational or dangerous, a man too rigid for a world addicted to compromise. But others, many others, wrote with the trembling honesty of people newly awake. Teachers paused mid-lecture, fumbling for words. Journalists found their pens heavier. Politicians, uncomfortable in tailored suits, issued carefully curated statements that somehow said nothing at all. In Paris, students began citing Traoré in their debates not just as a figure of fact, but as a force of conscience. In Johannesburg, a group of young filmmakers produced a short titled The Stage and the Mirror, in which a fictionalized host stares at his own reflection long after his guest has left, unable to recognize himself. In Lagos, a billboard rose almost overnight. It bore no advertisement, only a quote from the interview. "We do not need permission to be real," in bold black on white, stark and unforgiving as a wound. And in Ouagadougou, the people simply nodded. There was pain in their nods, pride too. An old man who had watched the segment on a flickering radio TV set in a corner cafe wept openly and said, "He did not speak for us. He reminded us that we could still speak for ourselves." The global South, long patronized by narratives crafted elsewhere, now found itself centered, not as victim, not even as resistance, but as authors of a story too vast and too human to ignore. Development agencies suddenly revisited their talking points. Universities revised course syllabi. Traoré's academic papers, once footnotes in dusty journals, now crashed servers with demand. Meanwhile, Trevor vanished from public view. A single statement, carefully drafted and deeply sanitized, appeared on his show's official account, some vague invocation of introspection and growth. But the eyes of the world had already moved past him. It was no longer about a man who faltered on live television. It was about the system that had shaped him, the smooth and smiling violence of a media engine designed not to reveal truth, but to render it palatable. Traoré had exposed more than a man. He had cracked the architecture. Quietly, invitations flooded Ibrahim's inbox. Forums, keynotes, editorials, appearances. Most he declined. He had no interest in becoming a symbol for someone else's narrative. He had done what he came to do. The world could now contend with itself. And yet, the echo of that night remained. Persistent, like the resonance of a bell that refuses to go silent. It lived in every uncomfortable pause before a question, in every shift of tone when Africa was discussed in polished studios. It lived in every student who now dared to challenge the framing of their textbooks, in every parent who felt a strange, unexpected hope surge when their child asked, "Who is Ibrahim Traoré?" The interview had been a moment. The truth it carried, however, became a movement. Not of anger but of clarity. Not of conquest but of courage. A disruption not just of television but of the global psyche. And for once, the world did not move on. It listened. In the silence that followed, Trevor Noah became a shadow of himself, a man once brilliant in the spotlight, now caught in its burn. He had always danced through controversy with a comedian's charm, disarming pain with wit, skipping across fault lines as though they were stepping stones. But something had shifted. That night with Ibrahim Traoré did not pass like the others. It did not fade with the studio lights or get washed away in the next news cycle. Clung to him. The laughter that once greeted him like a warm tide began to falter. Not entirely, not publicly, but subtly. He noticed it in the delayed applause, in the overly polite smiles of producers, in the way guests now measured their words more carefully than before. There was a new kind of weight to his name. Not prestige but pressure. People didn't look at him the same way. More importantly, he didn't look at himself the same way. The footage haunted him, not the part that went viral but the moments no one talked about. The flicker in his eyes when Traoré refused the cue cards. The crack in his voice when he tried to retake control. The shallow, reflexive jokes that fell flat, like thrown stones landing in deep water. At first, he tried to justify it. He had been ambushed. He wasn't prepared for that level of confrontation, of moral intensity. But those reasons unraveled quickly. They sounded too much like excuses. He began spending more time alone, tucked away in his apartment overlooking Manhattan's skyline. Books piled up around him. History, geopolitics, post-colonial theory, memoirs of revolutionaries he had never really studied. He read not to prepare for the next show, but to understand what had unraveled in him. The more he read, the less he spoke. And for a man whose livelihood had always been his voice, that silence became its own kind of exile. Colleagues reached out, but conversations were stilted. Some urged him to come back strong, to reclaim the narrative. But Trevor didn't want to reclaim anything. What was broken wasn't the story. It was the lens through which he had always told it. For the first time, he began to understand the privilege of always being the one who asks the questions, and the cost of never having to answer them. He turned down offers to reconcile with Traoré in a follow-up interview. The idea repulsed him. It wasn't a feud. It wasn't drama. It was a fracture in the soul of a format he had once believed in. The desk, the lights, the punchlines, it all felt artificial now, like armor that had finally cracked. One night, months later, he sat alone in the empty studio long after everyone had gone. He stared at the chair where Traoré had sat, unflinching, unbending, undeniably real. Trevor whispered something into the void. "I wasn't ready." And for the first time, he meant it not as an excuse, but as a confession. He began to write again, but differently. Not scripts, not monologues. Journals. Letters he never sent. Long, sprawling reflections about voice and power, about Africa, about silence. About how comedy can reveal but also distort. How easy it is to mistake applause for understanding. Trevor didn't disappear. He just stopped performing. Publicly, he took a hiatus. Privately, he began the slow, painful work of unlearning. And in that process, something unexpected began to bloom. A new kind of voice. Quieter. Slower. But rooted in something deeper than laughter. Something closer to truth. He may never return to the stage as the man he was before. But if he does return, it will not be to make us laugh. It will be to make us listen.